Welcome to this week's episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast, where experienced professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders based in Kingston upon Thames are invited on to share their story with us. I'm your host, Amyr Rocha-Lima.
This week's episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast is brought to you by Holland Hahn Wills, a financial planning and wealth management firm based in Kingston upon Thames. Holland Hahn Wills specialises in retirement planning for senior professionals and successful business owners. Visit hhw-uk.com to start feeling more relaxed and confident about your financial future.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast. I'm joined today by Paul Millard. Paul is the owner of Paul Millard Design, providing architectural design and project management services across a variety of sectors. What's unique about Paul is his unorthodox entry into the world of architecture, which he switched into while studying electrical engineering at university. And be sure to listen to the end, where Paul shares with us some helpful tips on what to think about before embarking on your next home improvement project. So whether you're interested in knowing more about the world of architectural design, or would like to know more about what it takes to run a successful independent business, then I hope you enjoy this episode of the Inside Kingston Podcast. Welcome, Paul Millard, to the Inside Kingston Podcast. Paul, I'm really excited about this conversation because apart from actually just having a general interest in architecture, as I'm sure a lot of people do, I think a lot of people and a lot of our listeners have been reconsidering their sort of living space, especially over these last 15 months of in and out of lockdowns. And no doubt some of them have actually embarked on sort of residential development projects, even if on a DIY basis. But I think from a professional standpoint, our listeners and myself can learn a lot from your experience in this area. But to kick off this conversation, I'd like to go back in time, if that's okay. So, Paul, where did you grow up?
Hi, Amyr. Nice to meet you, and thank you for this opportunity. Originally, I'm from Reading in Berkshire. So grew up there, went to school there, several generations of family from Reading, but dim and distant past, not been there for some 25 years now. So.
Oh, fantastic. And I'm guessing, Paul, because of your profession, that you studied architecture at university?
I did eventually. I went through a slightly unusual route. I actually went to university for the first time to study electrical engineering, which was pretty far removed from where I've ended up now. Clearly, that wasn't the direction I was meant to go in. So quickly changed that and ended up effectively doing a sort of slightly unusual apprenticeship for an architectural practice in Reading, which was really useful. I ran errands, I did what they needed and learned the basics, really. Learned how to draw, learned the basics of design, saw how a practice works. And after doing that for a while, it became quite clear that I needed to go back to college. So I then went and studied at Oxford Brookes.
Fantastic. You know, one of the nicest, the coolest bits about all of these conversations I've had on the Inside Kingston podcast is just seeing how varied and unorthodox many people's career paths have been to get to where they've got to. And I love listening and hearing that from yourself as well, Paul. We're kindred spirits. My journey into financial services as a sector and then into financial planning is completely unorthodox. And it's just, hopefully some of our younger listeners are listening to this and thinking, well, you know, I can figure out my way, start somewhere and get somewhere else. And that's absolutely fine. So that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'd also add, it's never too late to change your mind. I was, into my early 20s before I really found what I wanted to do.
That's amazing. So, yeah, very cool. And could you tell us a little bit about your career journey before you started your own business?
Yeah, I worked across a number of sectors in architecture, obviously for other firms and other practices. Fundamentally, I've kind of always ended up in sectors which were a little less commercial. Those were the areas that worked. So I worked for quite a long time in education. I worked in sports because that again is a slightly unusual sector. My sort of apprenticeship and upbringing involved a lot of commercial work, offices, industrial buildings, those kind of things. And it didn't really work for me. It wasn't personal enough. And I think the personal nature is what's kind of drifted me into where I am now.
And to bring this conversation to the present, could you tell us a little bit about your business today?
Yes. Paul Millard Design has been running for some sort of 5 or 6 years now. For the first few years, very much in the background. I was running it whilst also working with Kingston University on the client side, so helping them to manage projects, secure designers, and project managing projects through. So Paul Millard Design helped with that and also sort of ticked along in the background. And then a couple of years ago, opportunity came up to really push to do that full time. The university had just finished a couple of huge projects. We're clearly about to press pause on future work, having spent a significant amount of money. So I focused more on my business and ended up doing that permanently. I've done a range of work. I have done some collaborative work with other people, small commercial projects, but certainly over the last 2 years, the sector that's really boomed and really become popular and that I really enjoy is residential.
And with that in mind, Paul, I know you've taken on a variety of different projects and different styles when it comes to residential property development. Is there a design signature or a particular style that you're particularly interested in?
To be honest, no. I mean, it's a fair question, but actually, one of the things I like about residential is no two projects are the same, and flexibility and being able to adapt to individual properties and to clients' individual needs. Not only are all houses different, all owners and clients are different. I think is the key to what we do, really. Empathy and flexibility. You really have to be able to listen to people to understand what they want in order to be able to then feed your input in a way that will work alongside their requirements. And the thing is, coming from me, I'm originally from Brazil, as many of our listeners will know. And I think, for an architect, gosh, you almost can't get a more varied in style country to work in than England, right? Because there's just so much history in terms of the different styles of properties that are still around. I mean, our office building in Hampton Wick, it's 350 years old or something, and we have to stay within that style. But then you have everything from that to, sort of Art Deco, the interwar periods. It must just be very interesting to have that variety of rules to stick with, even though those rules are very different to each other. Those styles are very different to each other. Absolutely. And our borough in particular is fantastic for that. Yeah. I mean, there is such variety and such choice. And the way in which the borough has developed, just in over the last couple of 100 years, really, in terms of development and housing styles, is quite astonishing. I'm based in Surbiton, and you walk the streets of Surbiton and you'll see some fantastically varied, often quite ostentatious kind of properties. There's a couple down the road from me in particular, which would be more at home on in the Mediterranean. Pastel whitewashed walls and South of France villas. But it's fabulous. Love it. I love that there is such variety. I'm with you. And Paul, I wouldn't mind picking your brains, actually, for the benefit of our listeners, people who are perhaps considering, or as I mentioned at the top of the show, reconsidering their current living space. Are there any tips that you'd give someone when they're actually thinking of engaging with an architect to discuss a renovation project? I think the first thing is to have an open mind and is to really think about the basics of what you want. The first thing I say to all of my clients is tell me how you live. Many people will start with size and shape. I often tell the story when I meet clients that I've had one particular client who said, I want to build 6 meters down my garden and we'd like to paint the walls blue. And that's the brief. And then you have to kind of rewind and say, but actually, how do you live? Do you cook? Do you clean? Do you have children? Do you entertain? What's important to you? The classic example will always be, I worked for a young couple who we designed them a house and wanted a large open plan party space. They entertained a lot. They had big families. They had people over. We designed them. That they were very happy with it. I went to visit them one day, and the lady opened the door and said, "Really good news, Paul. I'm pregnant." And I had to kind of say congratulations, obviously, very good news, and then also sit them down and say, "We need to start again." Because suddenly your party space doesn't allow for a wet pram. It doesn't allow for, the kind of storage you're going to need. You have to adapt the space to your lifestyle.
Yeah, and I find that, for me, one of the most fascinating things about architecture. And I must say, Paul, I came to the realization that architecture was a discipline that is bothered with that sort of thing later in life. And it was, I think, many years ago, I read an article about a particular city centre that was working with architects, and I think with students at the time, to try to figure out how they could design the city in a friendlier way for a particular problem that area had with homelessness.
Yeah.
And that stopped me on my tracks. And I thought, I never knew that architects thought about that problem. And that's my ignorance, by the way. But I just, that's where the fascination with the feel that, that the fact that there is a discipline that is thinking about that, just as you described with that particular couple, I find that problem solving bit is really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I totally agree with you.
So, Paul, from what you're saying, it seems to me like there is a process that you think people might find helpful if they engaged in when thinking about the renovation process.
Yes, absolutely. And starting with lifestyle, how people live, very, very important. It needs to be what you want the space to be in terms of your own personal requirements. The detail comes later. Initially, we're focusing on, do you like to cook? Do you like to entertain? Do you have children? All of those fundamental life things that affect the space in which we live. So the process very much starts with something very loose and very basic. It's actually a little way in that we start to get down to details. One of the management tools that we have, which I think we do very well, and I'm very proud of, is we manage that process. Clients will come to me early days, and some will say, we cook, we entertain, our children cook, we want everything else. And then at the same time, they will say, I want a double sink, and I found a tap online that I like. And here's a picture of some light fittings. And that's brilliant. And what I always say to clients is, you can't give me too much information. Collect all those thoughts, put them all together. I will then organize them. And what we'll do is we'll park some of that detail because we're going to get to it naturally as the design develops. So our role is to sort of pick the bones out of that whilst never losing touch with the fact that that's what the client wants. But some of those thoughts we do have to sort of push down the line a little bit to get the fundamental right. And I think, like I said, organizing that process is one of the things that I think we do well.
Yeah, super interesting. And as with many of the conversations that I've had here on the show, I can definitely see parallels between our professions in a sense where we get folks who approach us near retirement saying, I've looked at these particular funds and I want to have a chat about them. And I'm like, great, well, let's just park that for a second. Now I understand your interest is there, but firstly, we need to really zoom out and we really have to have a look at, what does your life in retirement even look like? And then we have a conversation about the details. It's fun. It's really fun for me to see these parallels between my own profession and many, many very different professions. So that was really cool.
I think what's interesting there as well, I'd agree there are parallels. And I think possibly the similarity comes from the fact that for me and for you, whether people are looking at changing financial affairs, pensions, similarly for me, we're dealing with people who are often doing something for the first time and for the only time, and it's not their field of expertise. So there's a lot of trust that goes on, and trust is very, very important. So I think I do find a lot of clients in the beginning are actually quite nervous. They don't know where to start because they're very much out of their comfort zone. So reassuring people is an important part of what we do. And again, another similarity. People's finances is very important to them. And obviously I'm dealing with people's finances as well. They're probably about to go out and spend the second biggest amount of money after buying their house in the first place when they come to me. So.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. I strongly second that. And I think you used a word earlier in the show, Paul, which encompasses a lot of what I think we all try to bring to that conversation in our own way, which is empathy. Because, that being empathetic with the fact that people are nervous, they maybe interact in a transaction like this a couple of 2 or 3 times in their life, and that's it, is something that I think holds us in good stead for sure. So no, I appreciate you sharing that with us. Paul, I want to ask you a question that I've asked guests on the show for the last 15, 16 months now. How has COVID affected your business?
Unexpectedly is probably the first word that I would use. Obviously, when we went into lockdown spring last year, everything was very much an unknown. I formulated a little bit of a contingency plan for work drying up. Getting out and meeting people was we just touched on how important trust and empathy is. Also for me, seeing properties, standing inside spaces, understanding what doesn't work. Obviously, all of that dried up. We couldn't see people, we couldn't meet them. Zoom is great, but it's less than personal. And when you're maybe about to spend a 6-figure sum renovating your property, you want to look people in the eye. It's quite important. So that side became initially quite difficult. And then the unexpected part was actually a big upturn in work. Wow. Inquiries really started to flourish last year and have continued to do so. And early part of this year has been phenomenally busy. I can only attribute it to the fact that moving house became quite difficult for many people. They were spending a lot of time looking at the same 4 walls and a lot of time thinking about what they can do to actually improve their current property. That led to a lot of phone calls and a lot of interest in a number of projects. Carrying them out remotely was a whole different story, but we managed to get through that. And then into this year, similarly, it's just continued to rise. I think the housing market has also changed. A lot of my clients are clients who already own properties and have spent several years wondering what they could do to improve them. But a number of my clients, especially over the last year, we've seen a move with young people in particular wanting to move from flats to houses. They want that garden, they want that outdoor space. It's suddenly become very important as a result of lockdown. As people are coming to me during the buying process. So they're young people who've managed to find the funds and are buying a house, and they're possibly quite smartly actually buying slightly under their means with a little bit of float to improve it. So we've certainly seen that as an upturn in work as well. I think the only thing I hadn't planned for during the pandemic was to be too busy. And there was plenty of contingency for work not being there. But we're now coping. There was a spell last year where it was wonderfully overworked, which wasn't expected. But given how much others have suffered, I'm extremely grateful.
Yeah, very much so. That's a fantastic story, Paul. Paul, what are some of the key business lessons that you've learned throughout your life?
I think the important one is, I think there's 2 things. We already touched on flexibility, and I think staying flexible is really important. Throughout my career, not just running my business, but beforehand, being flexible with what you do. And with flexibility, I think there's a little bit of being brave as well that comes into it. Not being afraid to make changes, not being afraid to move on in a job to a job that is maybe slightly different, something not quite like what you've done before, pushing yourself slightly out of your comfort zone from time to time. And I think over the years, that gives you a range of skills. And I'll be honest, I've made decisions that worked and I've made decisions that didn't particularly work in terms of job and career. But every decision taught me something. So I think be flexible, be brave, and don't be afraid to adapt, because at times you're going to have to. And if anything, over the last year has taught us, when the unexpected comes, stand up, be brave, adapt, because that's what you're going to have to do.
Absolutely. It's the only way.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it works for me. Like I said, there's if I'm not learning something new, then the other things I'm also very easily bored. So I think actually being flexible, adapting, being brave, making decisions, moving in different directions is something that comes quite naturally to me.
Yeah.
Occasionally I have to rein it in and make sure I'm not doing it foolishly.
Very cool. And when you look back at your career journey to date, what are you most proud of?
I think I am proud generally. I mean, there are a number of projects. There are a number of areas that I've worked in. There are a number of things that I've delivered, either working with other people, for other people, or on my own. But I think in general, I'm quite proud of, I think, the effort that I've put into the success of those projects and being able to adapt, going back to flexibility, being brave, adapting. I have few regrets in terms of decisions I've made, because all of them taught me something. And I think I'm generally quite proud that I was brave and made those decisions. I think I did the right thing, and it's kind of put me in a position now where I have experience as a result of it, and it makes a lot of what I do much easier, because I can reflect back on that experience when I'm making difficult decisions these days.
Makes sense. That's really cool. And what next for you and your business? Are there any projects in the pipeline that you can tell us about?
Yeah, we're very busy. There's a number of projects at the moment. Housing projects, flexible projects in terms of a variety of size. We've got a couple of very lovely large properties in the borough, outside the borough. I tend to work kind of across the southeast. Having said that, unusual projects, interesting projects, we travel. I have a project at the moment on the border of Devon and Cornwall. Wow. Which is a beautiful large house in grounds surrounded by farmland, 15 minutes from the beach. Huge renovation, big extension, interesting client. That's fantastic. We also have some fabulous local projects in and around the area. So nice little renovations in North Kingston, Surbiton Berrylands, out into Elmbridge. Everyone is different, and all of them have their own quirks and are interesting. Historic buildings in Brighton, there's some fabulous, interesting properties on the seafront there. Recently done a listed building flat conversion down there, which had its own challenges, completely different again. Nothing like working in southwest London. The priorities down in Brighton are quite different. What people want is very different. And the views of the planners and historic building people down there are very different as well. Brighton has a lot of historic buildings. They're very sensitive. So it's nice to be in a position now where, to a certain extent, I can choose projects. Locally, I almost never say no, because I very much like working locally. But for the projects that are a little further afield, it's nice to be able to be a little bit selective and choose the ones that have a little bit more interest.
Well, that variety definitely makes for exciting times ahead.
Yeah, definitely. No, definitely. I think we can. There's definitely a lot going on. There's optimism at the moment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And long may it continue. Paul, as we start to wrap up, I'd like to ask you a few quick fire questions that our listeners are always interested in. So what do you do to relax outside of the office?
When there's time. I like to cook, to be honest. Quite. Both my partner and I are quite big foodies. We very much like eating out. When I can organise my diary and we can make the time, a nice long lunch on a Friday is pretty much as good as it gets. And obviously off the back of that, cooking's great. We cook a lot. We cook for ourselves, for other people. I like to experiment. So that's a lot of fun. Recently, I've rediscovered tennis, because I think if you have a passion for cooking and eating out, you've got to kind of find some exercise to offset it. Sure. So I've taken up tennis, which is something I played a lot when I was younger. And the only slight problem I'm finding with tennis, I have the same expectation of ability now that I had 20 years ago, and I'm struggling to find the same form. But very much enjoy it. That's good fun. Living by the river as well. Recently bought a couple of inflatable kayaks. So the plan is to try and get out on the water a bit more and see how that goes. Where we can. And then all of the usual things of big fan of music. Really missed live music in the last year hugely. We're in a fabulous borough for the arts. One of the reasons I enjoy doing what I do here is there are so many fabulous creative people doing amazing things. And the music scene I've really missed. The work that John Tolley and Banquet Records do, fabulous. Can't speak highly enough of that. So very much looking forward to getting back into that. And theatre, with the Rose, did a lot of work as well with Kingston School of Art at the university. Seen some of the fabulous work that they do, the work that they help put on International Youth Arts Festival. So anything creative locally is, really interests me, and I try to get involved with.
Very cool. Are there any books that you've recently read that you'd recommend to our listeners?
I had this conversation, funny enough, with my partner last night, knowing that this interview was coming. I'm a shocking reader. I will read newspapers online. I will read design books that are almost all photos. I have to struggle with the last time I read a novel. I think the last novel I actually read, which I really enjoyed, a pretty big book for someone who doesn't read much, was Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell.
All right, I haven't heard of that one.
Really, it's a crazy collection of stories that all have a single thread, and they intertwine and interweave over a couple of 100 years to go together. But I was just reading the book. I've also watched the film, which is a bit tricky once you've read the book. So.
I bet. Yeah. Does it do it justice? That's the question.
It's different. They're almost two quite different entities, because the books, neither are kind of linear. They're almost separate stories in separate periods of time, which then knit together. The film changes that timeline. So you're getting the same story told in a different way.
Interesting.
But that was quite fun. Yeah.
Well, with that in mind, then, are there any movies or TV shows that you've recently watched that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, movies. I'm watching all sorts. I have a 17-year-old daughter, so she's just discovered kind of horror movies and thrillers, and so we're watching those together. And then that often goes back to back with some old Disney cartoons or Shrek. So the variety is quite big. Personally, for me, I quite like anything that's a little bit quirky, a little bit different that's out there. If anybody hasn't watched Black Bear, that's an interesting movie. Slightly out there, slightly wacky. And personally, I do quite like the odd horror thriller. So Relic was a film from last year, which I enjoyed.
All right, excellent. Finally, where can people go to find out more about you and your business?
We're online. I'm currently redesigning the website, so there is a little holding page, but there's enough there for you to be able to get hold of me and get a feel for what we do. That's online at paulmillarddesign.com. And people can always email me at p.millard@paulmillarddesign.com, and I'm happy to have a chat. Locally, especially now with restrictions lifting, we have been doing socially distanced PPE house visits. Happy to continue to do that. And for local people, I'm happy to have a chat and go out and have a little visit. Almost always complimentary to get a feel for what they're looking for, and then we can look at fees and how it works moving forward.
That's brilliant. And for the benefit of our listeners, I'll make sure that I add that link to the show notes.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Paul, thank you for joining us here on the Inside Kingston podcast. It's been a pleasure getting to know your story.
No, thank you very much, Amyr. Lovely to meet you, and happy to share my thoughts and views with your listeners.
Brilliant.
That wraps up another episode of the Inside Kingston podcast. Make sure to check out our guests' website, pay them a visit, and help spread the word about what they're doing. If you have any questions or know someone who should be a guest on the show, please feel free to get in touch. I would also love it if you could go to iTunes and leave us a review and a 5-star rating. We work hard to bring on some great guests, and getting a review from you is one way to help the podcast rate well on iTunes so that others can find and enjoy the show too. Thanks for listening.